Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be talking about religious change in the Balkans today. You sent over some pretty interesting sources on conversions and tolerance. We've got like historical accounts. We've got scholarly analyses, even some Ottoman court records. The mission today is to figure out how these different empires handled conversion in the Balkans and what it meant for the people.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating mix. The Balkans have always been such a crossroads, so, you have to sort of untangle all these layers of history and culture to really understand it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in. A lot of the sources mentioned the Synod of Spalato in the 9th century. What made it so important?
So the Synod of Spalato was super important because it solidified the church's efforts to bring Christianity to the Slavic people. And specifically, they decided at that synod to establish a new bishopric in Stagno to reach Slavic tribes along the Dalmatian coast.
Okay, so it wasn't just some random meeting. They were really trying to strategically expand Christianity's reach.
Yeah, and the Metropolitan of Dyrrhachium, that's modern-day Albania, was a key figure in this push.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it sounds like a lot of these early Christianization efforts, though, were less about, persuading people and more about force.
Yeah, you're definitely picking up on a key point. You look at Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros I. His dealings with the Bulgarians in the early 9th century were anything but peaceful. I mean, he launched this brutal military campaign to try to conquer and control them.
Wow, so not exactly a very welcoming approach.
No, and it gets worse. Nikephoros I actually demanded taxes from churches and monasteries in Bulgarian territories to fund his war efforts. Imagine using religious institutions to finance a war against the people you're trying to convert.
That's pretty ironic.
Yeah.
It seems clear that religion was being used as this tool for power and domination, not just spreading faith.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this pattern continues even as the Bulgarians themselves adopt Christianity. So Boris I of Bulgaria converted in the mid-9th century. Seems like on the surface, it was about forming alliances with other Christian powers, solidifying his own authority.
Yeah.
But his methods, well, they echo that same Byzantine approach he was trying to break free from.
Interesting. So even though he was resisting Byzantine influence, he was still using their playbook.
He was. And, Boris I, much like Nikephoros, saw Christianity as a tool for control.
Yeah.
And he forcefully promoted it among his own people, which actually sparked internal resistance and conflict. It's this fascinating paradox, right?
Yeah.
He's seeking to strengthen his kingdom through Christianity, but ultimately using force to achieve those religious goals.
Yeah, makes you wonder about his true motivations. Was it genuine belief, political strategy, or a mix of both?
Right. Historians are still debating that. And it gets even more complex when you consider his sons. After his death, they actually face significant opposition, and they try to revert back to pagan beliefs.
Wow. So even though he adopted it and pushed it on his people, it didn't instantly just become universally accepted.
No, not at all. And it's a great reminder that religious change isn't just, a light switch. It's a process, and it's often really messy and unpredictable and has deep roots in power dynamics and social change.
That's a good point. And that push and pull between political strategy and genuine belief seemed to be a constant. I'm already seeing a contrast with what we'll be talking about with the Ottomans later on. But before we get to the Ottomans, I want to stick with Boris I for a second.
Yeah.
I noticed that he embraced the Slavonic liturgy.
Yeah.
What was the significance of that?
Oh, that was a big deal. So by adopting the Slavonic liturgy, he inadvertently fueled the development of Slavic literature and culture. So it's a perfect example of how religious decisions can have unintended but really profound cultural consequences.
Right. It's like this ripple effect, just changing the course of history in ways no one could predict. Makes you wonder what would have happened if he had chosen differently.
Absolutely. Boris I's story, it's full of ambition, political maneuvering, and ultimately these unforeseen consequences. And it really embodies the complex dynamics of religious change in the Balkans.
Okay, so we've been talking about the spread of Christianity, sometimes pretty forcefully, in the early Balkans. But now I'm curious, what happened when the Ottomans showed up? The sources I sent over paint a really different picture.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Instead of that outright pressure from the Byzantines and some of those Slavic rulers, the Ottomans took a much more, I guess you could say, hands-off approach, at least on the surface.
So no more like forced marches to the baptismal font or anything.
Yeah.
What was their strategy then?
Well, remember, the Ottomans ruled this vast and diverse empire.
Right.
And their system was built on practicality, not necessarily on like religious zeal. Um, and they had this thing called the millet system, which actually gave a lot of autonomy to different religious communities.
Like a millet system.
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard that before. But can you remind me how that worked?
Yeah, so basically each millet, or, each religious community, they had their own internal laws, their own leadership. They handled things like, marriage and inheritance, even some legal disputes within their community. So like Christians and Jews, they weren't forced to live completely under Islamic law.
Okay, so that sounds, at least for the time period, pretty tolerant. But was there I'm guessing there were still some benefits to being Muslim in the Ottoman Empire, right?
You're sharp. You're right. There were definite advantages, even though there was no official policy of forced conversion. Certain government positions, especially the higher-ranking ones, were reserved for Muslims. And the military was pretty much structured around Muslim participation.
Right. So even though it wasn't mandatory to convert, they still kind of structured things to incentivize it, right? I mean, it's subtle, but it's still a form of pressure, isn't it?
Exactly. It's subtle pressure. And our sources actually give us these little glimpses into how this played out in like everyday life. We have these documents called Kisve Bahasi petitions from the 17th and 18th centuries.
Kisve Bahasi.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I saw those in the material I sent over. What are they?
Okay, so they were basically requests made by new converts to Islam asking for clothes or money. Think of it as a symbolic acknowledgement of their new faith, kind of like a welcome to the community type of thing.
Oh, wow. So they were literally petitioning the authorities for, like, new clothes.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So who was doing this? Were these, like, rich or powerful people trying to climb the social ladder?
That's actually what's so interesting about these Kisva Pasis. They weren't just from the elite. We see everyday people, all walks of life, making these requests. Some might have been drawn to Islam for, truly spiritual reasons. But others maybe saw it as a way to improve their social standing or to get better economic opportunities or even to escape hardship.
Oh, wow. So it's like this historical puzzle trying to figure out what motivated each person to convert. How do historians even separate genuine religious conviction from, like, the realities of life in the Ottoman Empire?
Right. And it reminds us that historical events, especially on a personal level, are rarely black and white. People's choices are driven by so many different factors.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that strikes me is that, with Christianity, like we talked about with the Byzantines and the Slavic rulers, there was this real focus on mass conversions, even using force sometimes. But I'm not seeing much about Muslim missionary activity in the Ottoman Empire. Like, it doesn't seem like they were doing the same kind of thing.
That's a great observation. You've hit on another key difference. The spread of Islam under the Ottomans was much more organic. It was driven by social and economic factors, not top-down orders or like missionary zeal. It seems like they were more about incorporating people into their system than like actively trying to convert everybody.
Right. And I'm guessing the Devshirme system played into that, didn't it? That was their way of integrating Christian boys into the military and administration.
Yeah, you're right. The Devshirme was a huge part of the Ottoman system for centuries. So essentially, they'd recruit Christian boys, usually from the Balkans, and they'd train them for service in the Ottoman military or government. And these boys, they would convert to Islam and often rise to pretty powerful positions.
So the Devshirme system was kind of an indirect way to encourage conversion. Not forced, like in the sense of being threatened or anything, but it definitely channeled those ambitious young men into Islam, right?
Right. And, as the Devshirme system starts to decline in the 17th century, maybe converting to Islam became even more appealing for those looking to move up in society, especially since those government and military jobs, like we talked about, were limited to Muslims.
So it's like this paradox, right? On the surface, they're tolerant, but there's this underlying system that favors conversion to Islam. And the Kisve Bahasi petitions are like a direct result of that.
Yeah, and that's what makes this period so fascinating. We see this interplay between the official policies and what people were actually experiencing in their daily lives. Like, how did they navigate this complex social and religious landscape?
Right. Makes you wonder about the long-term impact of these different approaches to conversion. Did this more subtle Ottoman approach lead to people accepting Islam more in the Balkans compared to those earlier, more forceful Christianization efforts?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another really fascinating piece of this whole thing. The emergence of certain Muslim communities in the Balkans, like the Pomaks, whose origins are still debated by scholars.
Oh, right. The Pomaks. I did read about them in the material I sent over. They're a Muslim group, mainly in Bulgaria, on parts of Greece, right? But it sounds like their background is a bit of a mystery.
Exactly. Were they descendants of Turkish settlers who came during the Ottoman period? Were they converts from earlier Christian populations? Or were they maybe even descendants of Turkic groups who were there before the Ottomans? It's like a historical detective story, trying to figure out where they came from and what it tells us about how religion changed in this whole region.
Wow, it's amazing how these historical events are still shaping how people see themselves today, right? Like even centuries later, it's still sparking debate and discussion.
Absolutely. The legacy of all these conversions, both to Christianity and Islam, is just woven into the fabric of Balkan societies. It's influenced everything. The Pomaks, for example, they're a living testament to how complex this history really is.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't just like dates and names in a textbook, you know? It actually shapes the world we live in today.
Exactly. And when you look at the Balkans, you really see how much the past is still present.
Okay, so we take a step back. What are some of the biggest takeaways from our deep dive into religious conversion in the Balkans so far?
I think the most important thing to remember is that religious conversion is never a simple story. It's always intertwined with power, politics, social change, individual choices. There's rarely just one single explanation for why things happen the way they did.
It's like a puzzle with all these different pieces.
Exactly. And in the Balkans, that puzzle is even more complex because you have centuries of history, empires rising and falling, different faiths coming and going, and this constant mix of ideas and influences.
And we can't forget that the impact of religious change goes beyond just the individual. It shapes entire societies, cultures, even political landscapes.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding this history is so crucial. It helps us make sense of the world around us, It helps us challenge our own assumptions and appreciate how much the past still affects us today.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from the Byzantines and those Slavic rulers using force to the Ottomans with their more subtle but still influential approach. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've seen how conversion shaped the Balkans for centuries. But what about today? With all the nationalism and stuff happening in the world, are we seeing the same patterns repeating? Or is religious identity taking on a whole new meaning now?
Ooh, that's a great question. It really makes you think about how identity is changing and how religion and politics are still so intertwined. But that's a story for another deep dive.
So we've been talking about this really complex history of conversion in the Balkans, from the Byzantines to the Ottomans. But I keep coming back to, what does it all mean today? What's the lasting impact of all these conversions?
Yeah, it goes way beyond just which religion people ended up practicing, right? It's so much deeper than that.
Yeah, it's almost like you can't understand the Balkans today without understanding this history of conversion, right? How much did it really shape the region?
Exactly. I mean, think about the Pomaks, for example. They're still around today. And they're like a walking, talking example of how complicated this history is.
Yeah. Because, who are they? Are they Bulgarian Muslims? Are they Turkish descendants? It seems like there's no easy answer.
Right. And that debate about who they are is directly tied to all these questions about conversion and religious change in the Balkans.
Yeah, it's like you have to understand one to understand the other.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting how a lot of the impact of these conversions wasn't intentional at all. Those rulers probably didn't realize what they were setting in motion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, think back to Boris the First, right?
Yeah.
Deciding to use that Slavonic liturgy. He did that for political reasons. But it ended up changing Slavic literature and culture forever. It's amazing how these decisions can have such huge unintended consequences.
Wow, yeah. It's like history is full of these crazy chain reactions. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why should our listener care about all this? I mean, this stuff happened centuries ago, right? What's the takeaway for someone listening today?
Well, I think one of the biggest things to remember is that religious conversion, it's almost never straightforward, There are so many factors at play. Power dynamics, social changes, personal choices. It's rarely just about faith. And that makes it a really messy, complicated process.
Right. And I feel like that's a good lesson for today, too, to try to understand those nuances and not just see things in black and white.
Absolutely. It's so easy to oversimplify history, but the more you learn about it, the more you realize that it's full of these gray areas.
Right, exactly. And I guess that's why it's so important to study history,
Yeah.
so we don't repeat the same mistakes and so we can understand each other better. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. We've gone from those Byzantines forcing conversions to the Ottomans with their more subtle approach, and I think we've both learned a lot. So thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me.